quiet. Um, Man, it's never easy, when it's never easy when it's someone that, you watched, you enjoyed, you were such a passionate fan for. And I guess this is just one of those things where you just need to um familiarize yourself, or unfortunately acknowledge that this is just part of being a fan, of enjoying any any level of um, fandom, of genuine love for a a beloved figure. Um, we're gathered here today to commemorate the man and memory of veteran actor and honestly a generational performer in Tony Todd. Um, it was right before I went to bed this past Saturday that um unfortunately I saw the news, the tragic news at that. Um I had read that, and a week ago today, on November 6th, that Tony Todd had passed away. Ugh, man. I wanted to take some time to honor his memory and retrace the career that made him, for the sake of the fans that adored him. From humble beginnings to a marquee franchises that he performed in, to the role that he will forever be remembered by. This is Tony Todd. I struggle to call this Tony Todd's first big break because, in truth, not many people are even aware of this movie's existence. It's a very strange phenomenon because, much like how the James Gunn slash Zack Snyder Dawn of the Dead isn't readily identified as connected to the George Romero franchise, people by and large aren't even aware that such a high profile film like Night of the Living Dead even has a remake. Um I enjoy this movie, and I'm hoping it will get some shine and get some love now that the In Search of Darkness horror docuseries has turned their sights to the 90s decade. Get this. Um, Tony Todd won the role of leading man out of many contenders, including the likes of Lawrence Fishburne and even Ving Rhames. One major critique of this film is the obvious feminist slant when compared to, for instance, the original. Um, what I'm getting at is that there's a very much a bias here. And yes, unsurprisingly, even way back in 1990, feminist bias could adversely affect the film. While I don't mind the female lead having more agency in this movie, it is noticeable that they intentionally diminished the black male in order to prop up the white female. If you want to trade in the traumatized damsel in distress for a gun toting survivor, that's fine. And for the record, both the actress in the remake as well as the character she portrays are good in the role in the film. My grievance is, why did they deliberately diminish Tony Todd's character, especially in stark contrast to how assertive the same role was represented in 1968's original? He has to be less so that she can be more. With Tony Todd's recent passing and In Search of Darkness 1990 to 94 around the corner, I would really go for a black and white version of the 1990 remake. His second most noteworthy work in the very decade that catapulted his career would belong to the small screen. Here's something I'm really eager to delve into. This strikes an especially intimate chord with me because, in case you didn't know, I am something of an avid Star Trek fan. And I mean real Trek, not that Abrams Star Trash. It was here where Tony Todd really got to portray how dynamic of an actor he was. First appearing in 1990, yes, the very same year the aforementioned zombie remake released, Tony Todd would play the role of Commander Kern. Found it interesting that it was here where he played the role of as a snarling, scowling savage, the very stereotypical performance of the villain he's most famous for, but he not only managed to make it convincing as well as compelling, but he did it all while playing as one of the good guys. Um, in fact, he not only portrayed the mighty Klingon captain of a noble race, but he was revealed to be none other than the blood brother of Siri's favorite Worf. Oh yes, Michael Dorn had to share the screen, as well as the mantle of the biggest badass on the bridge when little brother was on the scene. It was a genuine delight when both men were embroiled in matters of family honor or fighting side by side in a civil war for an empire. The way they played off each other was something truly special to behold, and Tony Todd really held his own, embodying the ferocity and fervent posture of his species compared to Michael Dorn's more reserved demeanor. While the character would return in Deep Space Nine, it was Tony Todd's interpretation of an aging Jake Sisko, grieving the loss of his father, that would show the world the despair and the tragic side that this artist was capable of. In a role that demonstrated a son's refusal to give up on the rescue of his father trapped in a time loop, Tony Todd was able to portray the heartbreak and sorrow of a man unable to let go. The setup sees a space station captain fall victim to an accident where he is blinked out of existence, returning for brief moments every few decades. Stitch in time, so to speak. His guilt-ridden son makes it his life's mission to liberate his father from this affliction, but at the cost of his own life, in more ways than one. It is a truly gripping narrative of a boy who grows up without his father, but also of the love between them and rejection of the mere notion of a son abandoning his father to such a fate. The passion and painstaking resolve that Tony Todd showed in these 45 minutes of screen time establish his acting chops as a tragic figure. Transitioning now to the Voyager program, we have what is my favorite portrayal of the actor on Star Trek, even if his depiction was for a single episode. While the ruthless space hunter that he played was for this episode more of an anti-hero, it does portray flashes of malevolence, which still shone through. And let's be honest, villain Tony Todd is peak Tony Todd. Usually, a bad guy that takes no prisoners is someone you know means business. But what if not only dealing with a hostile species whose business it is to take prisoners, but what they do to their prey once captured is far worse. Tony Todd brought that calm acknowledgement to the cold-hearted butchery of this race, a recognition of the brutality these poachers inflicted in the pursuit of prey and the collection of trophies. What matters is the kill. All priorities are rescinded. I distinctly recall how the episode opens with these advanced hunters scaling back the influence of technology in their chase of a wounded target. Multiple times, Tony Todd, as the alpha of the group, limits the use of his own tracking tools to make it a more sporting game. truly embracing the thrill of the hunt. Really thought much of the Hirogen until this episode, but not only did Tony Todd make me a believer, but this is one alien hunter that would give even the Predator a run for its money. Finally, I have to give a shout out to the still to this day tragically unmade or unrealized franchise fan film Star Trek Axanar. Joining a host of veteran Star Trek actors, Tony Todd stars in the 21-minute passion project Prelude to Axanar. Just when you thought you had seen everything that Tony Todd had to offer, especially within Star Trek, he plays the part of a Starfleet admiral. The Federation that he serves has been repeatedly decimated and degraded in a conflict with an aggressive warrior race. They've either retreated on all fronts or been blown out of the sky. Morale is at an all-time low. Faith in the Federation flag is waning. Out from the shadows walks into the light a seasoned veteran officer to convey the one sentiment that as of yet we have yet to see Tony Todd deliver: hope. One rousing speech. Spirits are lifted. The crowd goes wild. Conviction is restored in the founding principles of the Federation, all from one impassioned sermon from a near career villain actor. It was this fourth appearance within Star Trek series that rounded out Tony Todd's performances and portrayed to the world the variety of drama he could present: valor, tragedy, menace, inspiration. Truly a master of of his craft and his class. From here, we return to the stomping grounds of fear fiction. While I wish that more people knew of and celebrated the Night of the Living Dead remake, there is yet another horror franchise where Tony Todd made a name for himself. If Star Trek was his second most prolific acting role, then it was in Final Destination where he had his second most prominent celebrity within horror. Throughout the Final Destination movies, it was Tony Todd who played the role of a coroner and overall prophet of doom. Whereas the teenage movie fans would explain the slasher rules in the Scream movies, Tony Todd's character explained the laws by which death itself would abide and its game that the survivors of the Final Destination films found themselves in. Just as mysterious and enigmatic as the specter of the Grim Reaper was, Tony Todd here played an equally cagey and cryptic figure. My feelings on this series notwithstanding, it got right what modern horror films should do, which is to tap the legends of the past in order to shepherd the franchises of the present. Most actors dream of becoming the face of a series. Well, with these movies, Tony Todd got to be the voice of the franchise. And speaking of speaking, let's go into his voice acting. I'm referring, of course, about his roles in Transformer Revenge of the Fallen, the Justice League and Superman villain Darkseid in three of the animated Justice League films, and even playing as Venom in the recent Spider-Man 2 video game that came out just last year. Always like it when my villains have a mentor or idol that they seek guidance from. It establishes something of a Darth Vader Emperor dynamic. The thought of Megatron having a master is intriguing, and with Tony Todd's signature unsettling speech, it's believable that it would be this figure that would direct the leader of the Decepticons. In fact, this film suffers because it didn't go further to develop this relationship and could have used that lethal injection of more Tony Todd. And if you've seen Transformers: Revenge of the Fallen and how it turned out, yeah, a lot more of its titular villain would have gone a long way towards sparing us from the movie's cringe. Moving on to DC Comics. If you were going to have anyone take over voice duties for Michael Ironside in his iconic portrayal of Darkseid, I, for one, couldn't think of anyone better than Tony Todd to assume the role of this DC supervillain. Much like the Transformers sequel, I just wish that the quality of the DC animated films lived up to the actor that played their central threat. Not to be outdone, he would delight in something of a double crossover for him in last year's Spider Man video game. This sequel to the Spider Man game allowed Tony Todd to not only do voice acting in video games, but now, for DC's competition, to have a premier role in a Marvel title. And on the heels of playing Superman's supervillain, what better role to voice than Spider Man's arch nemesis Venom? I mean, even the character benefited as well, with some dignity being brought back to Venom because Tony Todd couldn't do any worse than Tom Hardy. I kid. I know those movies are more of a product of mismanagement on on the Sony side than anything else. Speaking of Tony Todd, he was considered for the role of Dormammu in Doctor Strange. On the one hand, they really should have gone with Tony Todd. On the other hand, much like Mads Mikkelsen in that movie, it would have been a waste of his talents. All in all, this is a pretty impressive lineup for a voice actor, considering the number of franchises and high profile ones at that he was involved in. Additionally, shout out to his decisiveness in which roles to accept because these really are suitable roles for his caliber of voice talent. It's always such a shame when quality actors are miscast in a film, like Benicio del Toro in The Wolfman or William Sadler in Tales from the Crypt Demon Knight. These roles, however, were perfectly suited to Tony Todd's vocal gifts. As delighted as I am to see his appearance in childhood favorites of mine, such as childhood favorite programming, I should say, such as Xena and Hercules, it wasn't until I saw him in The Rock that I took notice over how imposing of a profile he cut. And at 6'5", yeah, why wouldn't he? Playing an ex-military turned mercenary, he really sold that badass Marine type, and both held his own and stood out amongst other convincing martial characters such as Sean Connery, Ed Harris, and Michael Biehn. He definitely gave off the impression of that he was not one with whom to trifle with, going so far as to stage a mutiny when his fanatical leader had a change of heart on the bombing threats during the film. Interestingly enough, Tony Todd actually was a serious supporter of American military veterans. And now we see through a glass darkly. Candyman is the scariest film from the 90s decade, and it's unfortunate that the film underperformed, as well as the fact that people don't acknowledge this fact to this day. Much like his horror sibling and fellow genre icon Pinhead from Hellraiser, as gruesome and dreadful as Tony Todd appeared, it is the command of his voice that can truly sow terror into someone's heart by way of their ears. I say sibling because, much like how Wes Craven was able to craft horror legends such as Freddy Krueger and Ghostface within the 80s and 90s decade, respectively, both Pinhead and Candyman trace their lineage to the Lord of Illusions himself, Clive Barker. I bet you didn't know that. Unlike Pinhead's booming voice, however, Candyman was more of a raspy, hypnotic resonance, which eerily played into the film's plot as his siren song would soothe his target Helen, and by extension, the audience into a mesmerizing dreamlike state through a foreboding lullaby. It is nothing short of astonishing and Oscar worthy how Tony Todd managed to play the character as a tragic figure despite the outright peril that he invoked on his victims and the turmoil that he sunk an entire community into. The layers of this character make for so much more of a complex and enigmatic figure than your run of the mill masked maniac. The irony comes in the setup where college student Helen would have been safe had she avoided temptation instead of chasing ghosts and tracking urban legends. Alas, once she had heard of the myth of this Cabini Green killer, you could say that Candyman had gotten his hooks into her, such as the forbidden fruit of curiosity, sweets for the sweet. If Freddy Krueger terrified an entire generation of children from falling asleep, Candyman traumatized the rest just with his mere voice. This this horror fan counted amongst them. I always like reading Reddits and forums asking horror enthusiasts what was their first scary movie that truly scared them. While sure, Channel 11 would have their Elm Street reruns and Friday the 13th marathons, Candyman was, without question, that horror movie that I was too young to watch. Tony Todd's performance was frankly unnerving. His is that class of portrayal that sticks with you long after you've watched the film. You enter your bathroom in the most vulnerable of moments, taking one last look over your shoulder, hoping that the only thing staring back at you is your own reflection. As fearsome as the man with the hook hand appears, as fear inspiring as bees already are, as ghastly as this phantom is after revealing what's beneath his coat, or rather what's left, it is that voice that remains ringing in your ears, echoing in your soul, long after the credits have rolled. I believe it was in the horror documentary Horror Noir where Tony Todd was informed by either a friend or a member of the cast that he would only ever be known for Candyman throughout the rest of his career. I understand that actors hope never to be typecast and dread being restricted in what roles they can play. But I hope this memorial of this acting career for the dearly departed has proven two things. Firstly, the sheer depth of artist this man was, and the variety of performances he can convey. And second, it's that Candyman was one hell of a portrayal and the role of a lifetime and a legacy. It was therefore that later that decade, excuse me, that Tony Todd in the film Wishmaster, awesome film by the way, was able to take his place amongst other horror legends. Robert Englund played Freddy Krueger, Kane Hodder, who played the majority of the roles of Jason Voorhees. It really was something special seeing all of them in not just a horror film, but all each of them systematically taken out by the main villain of this creature feature. Tony Todd appeared in dozens of classical and many experimental plays, yet still managed to find time to teach playwriting to high school students in the Hartford public school system. He had prominent guest starring roles in critically acclaimed shows, Let me know if any of these sound familiar to you. Boston Public, NYPD Blue, Smallville, Law and Order, The X-Files, Stargate, Babylon 5, and CSI Miami. He was no stranger to stage acting as well, starring in the world premiere of the award-winning playwright August Wilson's King Hedley II, as well as other theater plays such as Othello, Dark Paradise, and Ada on Broadway. I'm always careful to call an actor underrated because I don't want to label their career as lesser, and I don't want to undermine the work that they've done. But man, think about how much more cinema and television could have gotten out of such a dynamic performer as him. He could play warrior. He could play wounded. He could play cyborg. He could play Shakespeare. He could be hero. He could be villain. It was an actor of his caliber whose voice could portray such raspy menace and make it sound like poetry, whose eyes depicted such perilous intent and make it look like pathos. I was planning on doing a deep dive into Candyman and his legacy on my channel down the road, but the passing of the actor that immortalized the role gives me even more motivation to do so. Unfortunately, we never got a Lawrence Fishburne Tony Todd collaboration. If you're wondering what the commonality is there, to me, just two actors that can portray that sage and imposing, almost intimidating presence, no matter what role they play. Why relegate ourselves to speaking his name 5 times when we can remember his legacy for all time? Rest in peace, Tony Todd. If you're resigned to your fate, time to subscribe to your fears.
Warn your friends. Warn everyone.